Between here and here are a lot of miles and tons of college football history. The Alabama Crimson Tide and the Rose Bowl. It was in Pasadena, California, January 1st, 1926, that Alabama claimed its first National Collegiate Football Championship, the first unbeaten Alabama football team from the season of 1925. In the middle 20s, not much was said on a national level about Southern football. So when the invitation came for the Crimson Tide to travel west, the first Bear at Bama loaded his lads onto a train and headed toward an adventure that would begin a remarkable run of history for the University of Alabama football team. Wade, who had gone from a Tennessee farm to Brown University and played in the 1916 Rose Bowl game, knew a lot about the adventure waiting for his Warriors. But confining and hauling that much energy across the country was a challenge. Then freshman Jeff Coleman recalls some of the logistics.
Dr. Denny was encouraged to leave on the L&N and come back on the Southern. We knew nothing about train travel to California. So we left Birmingham on the night of the 19th of December and went up through St. Louis. It was cold, snowing, we were late. We got to St. Louis, we were running about a half a day behind. So they hitched us, our 3 cars, onto a new engine that had just been put in service, a 3-engine oil burner engine, and we started out down through Missouri and Texas and to Arizona. Trying to catch the train that we had missed, the connection that we had missed, to connect up with the main train. And it was a pretty rough trip.
You had to be a little lucky to have the whistle stops work for you. Weather and all, you know. But the whole thing was unique enough that cooperation was abundant. And in his best growl, Coach Wade was quick to remind all that Washington had already been made a considerable favorite over Alabama.
The only real stop we had was at Williams, Arizona, which is on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And it really was not a practice, but the boys walked through the formations, and we're just in their civilian clothes, didn't put on uniforms.
After Williams, Kingman, Barstow, and San Bernardino were just down the tracks and on into Pasadena.
We had 22 players that made the trip. 19 of them were native Alabama fellas. We put up at the Huntington Hotel, I believe. Some of the movie stars came over and had the pictures with some of the ball players. Didn't do a whole lot of sightseeing. I think the biggest thing we did was went out to San Pedro Harbor and had 11 battleships in the harbor on that particular day. We went through the USS California, quite excited for all these Alabama country boys.
But Coach Wade brooked no frivolity, constantly selling the idea to his lads that Southern football was not respected enough, and the opportunity was at hand to do something about it. Legend has it that in some of the posh back rooms, the Crimson Tide had been made 5 touchdown underdogs. The first Bear kept reminding all that Washington had one of the great players of all time in their triple-threater, George Wilson.
You see, we think about the Civil War. We're talking about how many years ago? Back in 1926, wasn't too far after the Civil War. So it wasn't much trouble in telling boys they represent the South and you're going to beat these Yankees.
Well, the threat of Wilson and the shadow of the team that was then sometimes referred to as the Purple Tornadoes was enough to keep the Sons of Alabama in line. That and an occasional accidental. Though it seemed quite obvious early on that the ladies of Dothan and Tuscaloosa had been right. Johnny Mac Brown did indeed have a certain bearing. You know, it was only right that the Alabama Crimson Tide be invited to come out here and play in the 1926 Rose Bowl game, because the 1925 football team was a terrific team at Alabama, and the Rose Bowl was the only postseason game being played. And what a game it was. It was 12-0 Washington at the half, and the boys in the back room were getting their jollies. Enter fate, in the form of Woo Winslet's knee meeting George Wilson's chin, which quieted Mr. Wilson for 22 minutes.
And I was playing left end, and Hubert would get the ball and give it to me, and I'd either pass or run. On this particular play, I was carrying the ball, and we came in contact with each other. I got up, and I don't think Wilson did.
Enter Johnny Mac Brown and Pooley Hubert, and bang, bang, bang. In less than 8 minutes, the Crimson Tide scored 3 times and led 20-12. Washington got one more score when Wilson returned to the game, but they did not have the 2-point conversion back then, and Alabama had a win, 20-19. Southern football had some respect, and Johnny Mac Brown didn't even have to go to a drugstore to be noticed. Champ Pickens became his agent, probably before the final gun. Coach Wallace Wade had become the first man to play and coach in the Rose Bowl. University President George V. Denny was busy counting money, and everybody else sang all the way home.
It was a wonderful, wonderful victory. It was quite a trip for the boy from Horseshoe Bend to be playing in the Rose Bowl.
The population of every stop along the Southern Pacific Line learned what Roll Tide meant. If they missed it in 25, they got another chorus in 26, because Alabama returned to the Rose Bowl for a second straight game. The Rose Bowl committee was quick to match up the Crimson Tide and powerful Stanford, coached by Pop Warner, Stanford having won all 10 of its games in the 26th season. Back in the 20s, most of the Western Rose Bowl teams came from north of Pasadena. Stanford was here in 1925, lost to Notre Dame. So Stanford was keen to come down for a game against Alabama in 1927. Alabama had been here the previous year in beating Washington, but most of the pundits who had forecast a Washington victory over the Crimson Tide apparently didn't learn a thing. They picked the Tide to lose again. Over the years, we have all seen these scenes. The massive bowl in the shadow of the San Gabriel Mountains. Interest was so high for that 1927 game that attendance went past 57,000. And gate receipts went past $218,000. There were no broadcast rights in those days, and the print guys didn't pay then either. It was a tough grinder of a game. Stanford led at halftime, but all the rambling up and down the rich turf of the Rose Bowl had produced just one score. And with about 4 minutes to play, center Babe Pierce slashed through the middle, blocking the Stanford punt at the 42-yard line. The ricochet wound up on the Stanford 14, first down Alabama. 4 plays later, fresh-legged Jimmy Johnson crashed into the end zone. Next, the point try. Pierce snapping, Winslet holding, Herschel Caldwell kicking. Woo remembers.
We got all set. I was going to hold the ball, and Caldwell was going to kick. And I told Caldwell right through the middle, oh boy, he was cold-blooded. Just as one of the greatest ball players we ever had. So we got all set. And then Barnes raised straight up and yelled, "Signal is off." And the Stanford team relaxed, and about that time, Holmes snapped the ball to me. Caldwell kicked it right through the middle of the goal post. Quite a play, wasn't it?
It was indeed a game that is well defined as one of the great ones in Rose Bowl history. About this time, the folks in Alabama are starting to wonder what in the world is so hard about this national championship business, except maybe you got to go so far to get it. Now, between that 1927 Rose Bowl game and the 1930 season, the Tide's rose did lose a little color. The team's record was 17-10-1. And what with all of the caterwauling, you would have thought those were losing seasons. The griping cut Wallace Wade to the core, so much so that he went out, secured the job at Duke, and resigned from Alabama as of the end of the 1930 season. Well, Jeff Coleman, by then on his way to becoming athletics business manager, picks up the story after President George Denny hired the next coach.
Wade had resigned from the University of Alabama in the summer of 1930, and he recommended Frank Thomas, a young coach assistant at Georgia. After Alabama and Georgia played in Birmingham, Thomas came over to the dressing room. The last game of the season, he coached at Georgia. He wanted to get acquainted with his players. Wade didn't like that. He didn't want anybody talking to his players until we'd played the bowl game. At that time, we weren't sure we were going to play in a bowl game. And so when this game materialized, of course, Thomas is going to the game as a guest of the university, but Wade told me to put him on the last car, on the last car on the train, away from the team, to try to keep him away from the players. He didn't want anything to distract his players from this playing this Washington State game.
A former Notre Dame quarterback coaching the Alabama Crimson Tide? Are you kidding? When Alabama won them all and got another invitation to Pasadena and a chance at another national championship, another grand adventure was begun. The Alabama Special was clicking its way west again. Among the players, All-American tackle Fred Singleton, who remembers one stop they made in San Antonio.
The alumni out in San Antonio gave us a present, and it was a baby burro, about, just big enough to walk good. And Coach Chris' wife had that baby burro in the baggage car of the train and fed it with a bottle all the way to the Rose Bowl. So we got out there, and one of the few times I ever said anything to Coach Wade, he said, "Well, what do you think about this gift from the alumni?" I said, "We take it out on the field with her." And I said, "Coach," I said, "it's a burr out in Texas." I said, "but in Alabama, it's a jackass." I said, "We better leave it in and we see what we do."
The Washington State Cougars would be the opponent for Alabama. And since this was to be his last game coaching the Crimson Tide, Wallace Wade was not about to let anything get in the way of winning. He was cranky.
Well, Coach Wade didn't let us go to the Rose Bowl parade. We didn't go to any entertainment. Of course, alumni had some every night, and so I watch that and think about it in contrast with what happens today when they go to a bowl. So day before the game, he said, "Well, we're going to take you out." And we thought, man, the man has relented. So he took us out. He took us out to an orange grove, and we picked 2 oranges and came back. So that was a big entertainment of the day. He was quite a guy.
2 oranges, no party, no parade. And he started his second team. Wade was crafty. He knew he had a superior team. And by starting the second unit, he demoralized the lads from the Palouse, and the Tide won going away 24-0 and got a piece of another national championship.
We were proud of the ball game there because they had said in the Rose Bowl, like they do with California press, that we couldn't pass, we couldn't run, and so what we did, we scored 2 on passes, 1 on running, and Whitworth kicked the field goal, so we won 24-0. Just happened to remember the score.
And the Wallace Wade era thus ended at Alabama, 61-13-3. 3 national championships, 4 Southern Conference titles, and 3 winning Rose Bowl trips. Not bad. And Wallace Wade had just exactly what he wanted for a departing message from Alabama. Top that? Well, Frank Thomas almost did. He went 9-1 in his first season, but there was still only one bowl game being played in the country, and Clark Shaughnessy's Tulane Green Wave got the invitation to come west and play Southern California. The Southeastern Conference came into being in 1933. Alabama won the first SEC title and, loaded with talent, won them all in 1934. Alabama was a powerful football team. Dixie Howell, Don Hudson, the stars. Bill Lee was an All-American. Several were All-Conference, including a big end named Paul Bryant. The Crimson Tide romping toward one more chorus of California, Here We Come. The tough tenor from Muncie, Indiana, who had quarterbacked for Rockney, graduated from the Notre Dame Law School, endured slings and arrows from the Wade supporters, now had his chance. And Coach Tommy used everything he knew getting his guys ready for that 1935 Rose Bowl game.
You know, there wasn't all the hoopla that there is now. We didn't think it was so bad, of course, but I think the people now would if they did that. We took this slow train, and I've forgotten how long it took, but we stopped a couple of times and finally got there, and everybody was happy when they could look out the window and see those palm trees and things like that. Mm-hmm. We played Stanford, and they had a real good team, and it was their second or third straight time to play in the Rose Bowl. I've forgotten how many times. And they had a good team.
The crowd was a record, more than 84,000. Game ticket price on the street, a robust $25. Somebody knew something. It was to be a Hall of Fame kind of a game for the Alabama Crimson Tide. Stanford, under Coach Tiny Thornhill, scored first and rather easily to lead 7-0, and immediately became subject to a spasm of false security. The folks in the West had seen the Notre Dame box and assorted other offensive formations, but they had never seen people like Dixie Howell and Don Hudson, who covered the field like flickering shadows. The graceful receiver Hudson wore out the Stanford defensive backs. Where he went, they followed, and that left some avenues open for other people to travel. When the day was done, the Crimson Tide had won decisively 29-13, and as MVP applause was showered onto Dixie Howell, professional scouts were looking for Don Hudson's signature, and Coach Frank Thomas was now the man in Tuscaloosa. Dixie and Don got to snuggle up for a picture with Phyllis, and Guy Lombardo had a new hit song. This fellow stands through all manner of weather, outside the wall of the Rose Bowl, representing all the great players who participated at one time or another in the Rose Bowl game. The first game was played in 1902. That's why they call it the Granddaddy Bowl. These plaques on the wall behind us define each game, the score, teams, coaches, and MVP. It all started this Court of Champions in 1989. So a lot of the installation ceremonies are still going on. As a matter of fact, in 1993, 2 new names were added to the Hall of Fame roster, 2 Alabamans, Millard Dixie Howell and Don Hudson. Alabama was 9-0 at the end of the 1937 season and came back here to the Rose Bowl, but was handled by the California Golden Bears 13-0. It was California's last national championship. Meantime, other postseason bowl games were a-borning in the middle 30s, and as the calendar turned into the 40s, Alabama was invited to come to Dallas, Texas for the Cotton Bowl game against Southwest Conference champion Texas A&M.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
War was imminent, Europe was in turmoil, and the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. It was a tough time to play a game.
There were blackouts everywhere. I remember we went into Dallas. The town was partially blacked out because of the war. Pearl Harbor happened just after we got the invitation to play in the Cotton Bowl, and the country was very tense and somber, and the feeling of most of the people was not on football at that time, and it was on the war. And I know the feeling of our players where we felt like that we would play this game and play at the best of our ability, but shortly thereafter, there's a lot of the team members and myself went right into the service.
Alabama recovered 5 fumbles, intercepted 7 passes, had only 1 first down the whole game, but won 29-21. And 3 rating systems voted them a very shaky number 1 based on schedule. Minnesota got most of the votes that year. High blood pressure kept Frank Thomas at home during the war years. He was slowly losing his strength as the years wore on. There was no football at the Capstone in 1943, like a lot of other campuses across the country. But the game returned in 1944, mainly with a bunch of teenagers, including one from Woodlawn High School in Birmingham, and he was special. His name was Harry Gilmer, a loping, leaping rubber band of a fellow who finished his career with 15 interceptions, still 3rd all-time best after half a century. The line was anchored by Vaughn Mancha, the one-eyed center who, like Gilmer, would grow up to be everybody's All-American. The opponent in the Rose Bowl was Southern California, and the Trojans had clearly established themselves through the late 20s and 30s as one of the premier college football programs in the country. The Tide and the Trojans had met in the opening game of the 1938 season, with Alabama winning 19-7. Alabama had 4 wins in 5 previous trips to the Rose Bowl. Southern California had won 8 in a row. Bama's War Babies jumped to a 7-0 lead using a very efficient ground game and USC mistakes. And it figured they would start quickly because Coach Tommy had them all jacked up before the kickoff.
Coach Thomas was a Notre Dame man, and he had played for Rottney, and he had a lot of Rottney in him. And so the team is seated on the bench, and it's time for Coach Thomas to make his little talk. Back and forth he paces, back and forth. He gets in front of our very best football player, who's our center, named Vaughn Mancha. And he says to Mancha, or he says to the team, but in front of Mancha, for us to win today, we've got to block and tackle. He said that in a very firm, stern voice. Then he repeated, block and tackle. The 3rd time was a scream. The 4th time he hit Mancha's shoulder pads with both fists, and he screamed, block and tackle, block and tackle. And he was like a madman. We'd never seen him do this before. This is a first. Then, just as suddenly, he said, let's go. And with that, we jumped to run out of the locker room, and they couldn't get the door open. Now, he winds up behind us, and he screams, I said, let's go. And with that, we surge again just as the door comes open, and it's about 3 or 4 steps out and down into the tunnel, and the entire team piles up there. And literally, as I went out of the locker room, I walked right across players that were ahead of me who had stacked up.
As the game rolled along, it was obvious the Tide was in control. Hal Self scored twice. Gilmer, Lowell Tew, and Norwood Hodges added 1 apiece. At 34-0, Coach Thomas cleared his bench. The final score, 34-14 for Alabama. In the weeks following, it grew increasingly clear that Frank Thomas would have to give up coaching soon. His health was failing. The 1945 season, 10-0, and a Rose Bowl win was not enough to pass Army as number 1. But then Army did have an edge back in those days. And with Frank Thomas about to hang up his whistle after the 1946 season, it was fair enough to talk about the end of an era. Thomas ended his career at the Capstone with 115 wins, 24 losses, and 7 ties. 4 SEC titles, 2 national championships, and 3 trips to the Rose Bowl. Well, to be sure, the Rose Bowl is a long way from the capstone in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But it was a great thing for the university and its football program. I mean, to come here back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and win, dang, I'll tell you, it made them sit up straight and take notice. And I'll tell you what else it did. It made the people out in the west and the northern half of the country realize that those boys could play football down south, too. Harold Red Drew was the Alabama football coach succeeding Frank Thomas, and through the 1954 season, his teams won 55 games, took teams to the Sugar Bowl, Orange Bowl, and Cotton Bowl. But after a 4-5-2 season in 1954, Red Drew was followed by J.B. Whitworth. Here's 3 teams, won 4 games in 3 seasons, and you know what happened. Paul William Bryant was the coach salt. Alabama football would never be the same after Paul Bryant signed his 10-year contract. He had been to Maryland, to Kentucky, and Texas A&M. He had been seasoned just enough when Mama called. The Alabama Crimson Tide won national championships in the decades of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They were shut out in the 50s. But Bear was home, and the 60s were coming. Well, this is the granddaddy, the Rose Bowl, the most famous football stadium in the world. Hello, everybody. I'm Keith Jackson. Obviously, the Rose Bowl and the University of Alabama Crimson Tide football team, close ties in college football history, and they should. They had some exciting times together, no question. But you know what? The most famous coach of them all at the capstone was never able to bring his team here and coach a team in the Rose Bowl. He played here, yes, but never coached here. Couldn't because of the Big Ten, Pac-10 tie-up with the Tournament of Roses. But there was a time, a fleeting moment in the early 60s when it almost happened, but it didn't. But then Coach Paul Bryant never missed a whole lot while he was the football coach at Alabama. I mean, heck, you can have fun anywhere as long as you're winning national championships. History is made and championships are won with people. And in college football, that translates into recruiting. Grit, gizzard, courage, talent. Probably the assets of the whole team in that order. Men who came to play football at Alabama because they wanted to be building blocks for a foundation that would reach across decades and generations.
One of our first occasions to visit with Coach Bryant was a room full of freshmen, and he came in and started talking about the little things, and I think that makes a difference in a winning or championship football team. Doing the little bitty things. You got to do the little bitty things to get to the bigger things. And he guaranteed us, and that's the words he used. He said, I guarantee you in 4 years, if you go out there and do these little things I'm asking you to do, if you put out 90%, come out there and put out 110% the next day, make up the difference. Always accomplishing that one little thing. Somehow or other, in everything you do, walk around campus, you got to create an atmosphere, an air about Alabama football. If you do these little things, I guarantee you, in 4 years, when you're seniors, you'll be national champion.
In the fourth season, 1961, the pieces were in place for Bears boys to begin a championship march that would carry through 2 decades.
1961 team had a great group of guys, had tremendous work ethics. We were smaller than most teams, but we worked on quickness and endurance, and I think the real thing was hard work. We always believed that if we stayed close to the team, we could beat them in the third and fourth quarter because we'd be better conditioned and just work harder than the opposing team.
The biggest thing is it takes 11 guys thinking and doing the same thing. Now, if you don't think they're going to score, he says ain't no way in hell they're going to score on you.
Only one team scored as much as 7 points that season, North Carolina State with Roman Gabriel. 11 teams could only score a total of 25 points. Only 2 games could be called close, 9-0 over Tulane and 10-3 in beating Arkansas in the Sugar Bowl. And the Sugar Bowl was the punctuation of the national championship. The late Pat Trammell was the leader of that 61 team, and his mates all make that point. He could get pretty salty in the huddle sometimes.
Pat Trammell was a great leader. He had that fire and enthusiasm, take charge kind of guy, which you love in a quarterback. He was a hard-nosed, more like a linebacker than there was a quarterback as far as his attitude toward football, but he was the guy in charge when he was on the field.
Coach Bryant gave him authority if too many people were mealy-mouthing in the huddle that he had the authority to quiet you and send you off the field. And he certainly didn't want to go off the field. And people back in Demopolis, Alabama wouldn't understand that. Why did you go off the field, right in the middle of a ball game?
You really knew where he stood all the time. He was very demanding of his teammates. And everything all said and done, Pat Trammell was a complete winner.
One other factor that came and went with that early group that would influence the future, they all believed. They all succeeded, and then they went forth as the best salesmen you ever heard.
When Coach Bryant came here, he established his brand of football, his way of thinking, his approach to the game, to the defensive part, the kicking game, and being a team with a lot of pride and it played with a lot of class. And it took 3 or 4 years to kind of establish that way of thinking. I think this is one thing that has carried on through the following years.
1961 was a special team, I think, and had great significance, I believe, because I think it reestablished Alabama as a national power and a team that had to be considered every year.
And others of quality came, like the lanky lad from western Pennsylvania, Joe Willie Namath. By 1964, the guns were sufficiently loaded again.
I remember in the summer, Coach Bryant always sent a letter out kind of setting the format for the coming season, and he said it in that letter that said, you can win a national championship this year, and I think that was the first time he had mentioned it to our group in the summer letter, and he said, you can do it because you're not ordinary people. Ordinary people won't do what you've done in getting to this point, nor will they do the things that you're going to do this summer in preparing to become national champions.
And the march was on again. despite the fact Namath would go down with a knee injury in the 4th win of the season over NC State. This starting a siege of pain from his knees that would be with him the rest of his life.
I think what it said when Joe Namath went out, that it was up to the rest of the team to reach a little deeper. And I think that's exactly what happened. I think as a team, we probably came together more as a team, and people accepted a little greater responsibility seeing success follow.
Steve Sloan stepped in at quarterback for wins over Florida, Tennessee, Mississippi State, and LSU. Namath was back for Georgia Tech and Auburn, and the Tigers were a load. In that game, Ray Ogden, 108-yard kickoff return as Bama won 21-14. Notre Dame then lost to Southern California, and the Crimson Tide was #1 in the polls and national champions for a 7th time. 2nd time in the 60s. Bowl game results did not count in the national polls then, and that was fortunate because the Tide lost to Texas 21-17 in the Orange Bowl. A thundering battle, and the outcome is still disputed. Now, on January 2nd, with that Orange Bowl decision still stuck in his craw, Joe Namath agreed to the richest rookie contract in the history of professional football. And, of course, you know, Joe went on to become a rather historic figure in pro football. Now, to be a national champion in anything, you got to be pretty good. But you also have to be lucky. And 1965 was a very good lesson of that for Alabama football. The opening game was between the hedges against the Georgia Bulldogs, with Alabama leading 17-10. Georgia quarterback Kirby Moore passed to Pat Hudson. Seemed down on his knees, but he lateraled to Bob Taylor, who raced 73 yards for a touchdown. Oh, you should have heard the words. But Moore then passed to Hudson for a 2-point conversion, and Georgia had the win 18-17. Then there was the 7-7 tie with Tennessee. The Tide ran all over Legion Field, but could score only 7 points. That's the game in which sophomore substitute quarterback Kenny Stabler threw the ball out of bounds trying to stop the clock, not realizing it was 4th down. That was the night that Coach Bryant kicked the locker room door off its hinges.
And we came in as a padlock on the door. Coach Bryant told Chief Smelly, said, "Get your damn gun out and shoot it off." And he wouldn't do it. And Coach Bryant kicked the door. And it came off his hinges, and it went back and hit, and came back, and he forearmed it. Walked in, said, "Everybody sit down, don't say a word."
Of course, at that time, it was difficult to think that you could repeat as national champion. You know, Coach Bryant was a great person as far as keeping kids on track and keeping them to persevere. And we kept in mind that we still had an outside chance at winning, and our team just got better as we went. And of course, when we got to the bowl game, then we had that opportunity.
Now let's ponder this luck thing for a minute. There had been so much squawking in the wake of the 1964 polls when Alabama had been voted #1 before they lost to Texas in the Orange Bowl that the poll people said, all right, we'll include the bowl results in our final poll starting with the 1965 season. And that was Alabama's first stroke of luck. Now here's the rest of it. At the end of the season, #1 Michigan State's in the Rose Bowl. They lose by 2 points to UCLA. #2 Arkansas loses in a close game to LSU in the Cotton Bowl. #3 Nebraska now, with all the other games complete, is playing #4 Alabama in the Orange Bowl. With 2 of the 3 unbeaten untied teams already down, the nation's football eyes focused on Miami. Alabama was a team of darters, outweighed dramatically by the beefy Cornhuskers that Bob Devaney had brought from the Big 8 Conference.
They were one of the big teams in the country at that time. They were one of the first of the large teams. They had a number of guys that went into pro football. We, of course, had a game plan that was to be a wide open team for that game. We knew that just getting in there and trying to pound out a game against them would be very difficult.
It was a decisive 39-28 win for Alabama and good for a 3rd national championship in the decade of the 60s. Football wasn't made to bounce straight. And while the Tide had so much good luck in 1965, they didn't have any in 1966. Nobody voted first place for them anywhere. And yet Bear always felt that that 66 bunch might have been his best team ever. The 1966 season featured one of the great college football games of all time. Where else but in Knoxville against old foe Tennessee. Neyland Stadium was stuffed as usual, despite pouring rain, the kind of weather a swamp rat loved. Tennessee quarterback Dewey Warren was called that by the home folks. And he was a daring dandy who had the Big Orange in front of Bama 10-0, well into the fourth quarter. Then up stepped the snake. Kenny Stabler marched the Tide down the field, ran to the one himself, and then stuck it in the end zone, followed by a 2-point conversion pass from Stabler to Wayne Cook. 10-8 Tennessee, time becoming precious. Bama ball their own 25-yard line. 13 plays later, in one of Ken Stabler's greatest moments of engineering, Stabler then handling a low, skidding snap. Place kicker Steve Davis knocked it straight through. Alabama 11, Tennessee 10. But with what little time remained, Tennessee came storming back and then missed a chance to win with a field goal try from the 3 as time ran out. The Tide routed Nebraska 34-7 in the Sugar Bowl, but if you remember, 1966 was the year of the celebrated 10-10 tie between Michigan State and Notre Dame. Alabama finished third in the polls. It was an aggravating, even disheartening aftermath that may have had something to do with that lackluster finish of the 60s. Coach Bryant was also a little touchy over the fact Alabama never had a Heisman Trophy winner. Not even a real strong candidate for that matter. And you know that Alabama had some people that could have been very obvious candidates during the 60s. And two, there was all that business about going to the pros, Miami in particular. But once all that dust settled, got the wishbone in place and it started really working, there came the season of 1973. That 73 crowd could move it up and down the field. For the season, scoring 477 points, averaging 480 yards per game, a season in which they even scored 42 points against Tennessee and gained more than 500 yards. With number 1 in their possession from the UPI coaches poll, Bama headed for the Sugar Bowl to meet Notre Dame. The Irish also unbeaten, 10-0. And ranked third in the national poll. It was a college football game for the ages. The coaching matchup was as good as advertised between Paul Bryant and Ara Parsegian. So was the quality of the team. Some recollections from that game, beginning with defensive tackle Randy Hall.
It was a devastating loss. I mean, we had a great team, offensively, defensively, and should have won the game. You know, a couple of big plays that cost us, and it's one game that we've probably never gotten over. But that Sugar Bowl game was, you know, it was one of those epic meetings of Notre Dame and Alabama, and it lived up to its expectations. It really did.
The problem that we had in that game was we came up the line of scrimmage, and we were in a right formation, which meant that there were 6 men on the line of scrimmage. They ran a 4-man front, and their 4 men were wider than our 6. I mean, it was the biggest human beings we'd ever seen in our life. And, you know, you couldn't see over, under, or around. And it took us the better part of a full quarter. I think we had 0 yardage first quarter. It took us a full quarter to find out that they really weren't that tough, and that we could move the ball and we could execute against these guys. And so we really played 3 quarters in that game, and we lost by 1 point. So I always felt like that if we'd have had a full 4 quarters, we'd have won that game. We would have beat them.
But thanks to the UPI Coaches Poll, which came before the bowl games, the number of national championships hanging at the capstone now numbered 9. Alabama football didn't fade after that heartbreaking loss to Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl. Undefeated 1974 regular season, went to the Orange Bowl and played Notre Dame. Lost by 2, 13-11. And that may have been an even tougher loss than the one in the Sugar Bowl. 1977 had a double edge for Alabama. New Year's Day, they demolished Ohio State in the Sugar Bowl 35-6. But Notre Dame beat top-ranked Texas in the Cotton Bowl and jumped all the way from 5th to 1st. And by now, the Alabama football faithful were getting weary of being plundered by Notre Dame. But that's the way it was in the game of opinion. The Tide played a killer schedule in '78, opening with wins over Nebraska and Missouri. Then Southern California came to Legion Field with Charles White flying all over the place and lefty Paul McDonald throwing darts, plus Alabama's 6 turnovers. Not a pleasant evening for the home team. 24-14, the Trojans won. And the old balloon looked kind of limp. But a win over Washington in Seattle, close as it was, 20-17, helped get some air back in it, and then good things started happening. November 11, LSU, a ranked tough team, came to Legion Field, and a hard game was cracked open in the fourth quarter. The final was 31-10. And news came that Nebraska had knocked off top-ranked Oklahoma. Next, Auburn did Alabama a huge favor, if you can believe it. The Tigers played heavily favored Georgia to a 22-22 tie. And suddenly, the Crimson Tide had control of its own destiny. Beat Auburn and play for another national championship. And they did just that. Again, a matchup of Hall of Fame coaches, Paul Bryant and Joe Paterno. Penn State ranked number 1, Alabama number 2. It was a matchup of the highest quality, a game that actually transcended the hype. Alabama got the lead after a quarter and a half of sparring when Tony Nathan broke loose for 55 yards. Jeff Rutledge then hit Bruce Bolton from 30 yards out. Point good, Bama, 7-0. After the first half, it certainly looked as if defense would dictate the outcome. And defensive secondary coach Bill Oliver remembers this about the plan against Penn State.
I think if you really, even though it would turn out to be a defensive battle between two great teams, really truly both offenses were absolute superb all year long. If you look at the number of points scored by each team, it was unbelievable. The thing that probably is really mind-boggling or shocking, you might say, that I think we sacked Chuck Fusina something like 76 yards or 79 yards in that game for losses. And they had great players, and Scott Fitzke and people like that, but a guy named Gooman at running back. But it turned out to be a game, a build-up game between two great football teams that had been scoring a lot of points and turned into a tremendous defensive battle there at the end.
Lions quarterback Chuck Fusina finally found a crack in the third quarter, throwing 17 yards to Scott Fitzke, and the game was tied at 7. Then Lou Eichner fielded a state punt and hauled it back to the Nittany Lions' 10-yard line. Out of the wishbone, Rutledge pitched to Major Ogilvy, who banged into the end zone, and the Tide had the lead 14-7. But the drama was actually just beginning. In the final period, Penn State recovers an Alabama fumble at the 19-yard line. Move the ball to a 1st and goal at the Bama 8-yard line. One of the biggest plays of the game may well have been this one, where Don McNeil stopped Scott Fitzke just 1 yard from the goal line. Then came the 2 tries by the big backs. Matt Suey first, and then Mike Gooman.
Sort of really tops it all off when you sit there and, you win it 14-7 and preserve the win. And it was really something. And, a lot of people don't realize a lot of things that happened in that goal line stand, but you take people like Mike Clements and our Don McNeil, the play that Don made, but Mike Clements made a play that nobody's ever said anything about. When Gooman got ready to jump over the line of scrimmage on 3rd and 4th down, where all the linebackers got all the credit, Mike Clements had him by the ankle, and he couldn't jump. And it made it a lot easier for a lot of other people, and of course our penetration by our front people was just unbelievable. But it just goes in with one of the many great ones, that's been around here, and that's what really makes it, I reckon when we say what makes us sell tickets.
National Championship number 10, one of my all-time favorite games. It seems in every great football game, there's always a story within a story within a story. Well, now, there was a moment of high drama that came right after that goal line stand. Remember, Alabama stopped them down on the one. Woody Humphrey came in to punch, standing right back against the baseline, and he popped it barely 20 yards. And here's Penn State. They're still looking right at the end zone. All of a sudden, the Penn State coaches were on the edge of the field, shouting, waving their arms, trying to get a 12th man off the field. That judge saw it, started counting, threw the flag. Penalty, ran out the clock, Alabama won the ball game. I got a feeling, looking back at the tape, that if they had been quiet on the Penn State sideline, nobody would have noticed that 12th man. And who knows? In 1979, Alabama had won 5 in a row with ease when Tennessee came to Birmingham on the 3rd Saturday in October. You would have thought the Tide had forgotten to tie their shoelaces or something. Before they could even hitch up their britches, they were behind 17-0. Quarterback Jimmy Streeter was driving the Big Orange train that year, and he was having a hoot at Legion Field. Bama started settling some in the second period. Stedman Shealy had a 33-yard scoring strike, but at the half, Tennessee led 17-7. And you have to know that that kind of performance would rouse some memorable oratory from Paul William Bryant. Don Jacobs stepped in at quarterback in the second half, led the comeback, capped a 14-play drive that covered 80 yards, running the last 13 himself for the big touchdown. The defense shut down Jimmy Streeter in the second half, and the Tide won the ball game 27-17. There was another spot of quicksand in the 1979 schedule for Alabama, down in Louisiana's version of Death Valley. Coach Charlie McClendon loved to have company come under the lights in the city of the Red Stick. We tried hard to get Charlie Mack to change the game from night to day so it could be televised, but he would have none of it. He wanted to be one of the boys to beat the Bear, and he almost did, losing only 3-0. A downpour turned Tiger Stadium into a massive mud hole. It was fortunate nobody drowned, and Alabama was very, very fortunate to get out of Baton Rouge with a win. After whipping Miami 30-0 at Tuscaloosa, and that was the Miami team with Jim Kelly at quarterback, it was back down the road to Legion Field and that old minefield called Iron Bowl. The Auburn Tigers were a ranked team, 8-2, and on Iron Bowl day, spoiling for a fight. The Tide jumped to an early lead. Quarterback Stedman Shealy slicked them into the halftime, leading 14-3, but there was trouble coming. The score rose to 17-6, and then Alabama started dropping the ball. 4 fumbles dramatically added to the excitement factor, and Doug Barfield's Tigers were cashing the Alabama mistakes to the point where Auburn led 18-17 with 11.5 minutes to play. After another drop covered by Major Ogilvy, Stedman Shealy got the white shirts moving in the right direction. There was a terrific run by fullback Steve Whitman. And then the winning touchdown called by John Forney on the Alabama Radio Network.
Wide side of the field is left. Looking out that way is Stedman Shealy. Shealy rides it in, keeps himself, goes to the left, keeps the 5, 2, touchdown for Stedman Shealy. And Alabama regains the lead.
But as the Crimson Tide headed back to the Sugar Bowl to play a very good Arkansas team, Ohio State was number 1 in the polls and Alabama number 3. Lou Holtz, then coach of the Razorbacks, thought by many to be one of the best big game coaches around, watched the Alabama defense blunt every Arkansas try when it counted. And then under Stedman Shealy's leadership, the Alabama offense started to roll right along. Mal Moore, Bama offensive coordinator, details the shift in the offensive scheme which caused the Razorbacks so much grief.
We felt that, that Arkansas played a very good scheme against the wishbone. They played against Texas, year after year. And so we came with a double wing, with the backs to the tight end side in the wing position, the back to the split inside also in the wing position. But we ran the same offense, but we did it with a little bit of movement. But by going to that alignment, it put Arkansas in a little different scheme defensively. They had now, because we had 4 quick receivers on the line of scrimmage, and I think it may have caught them off guard a little bit, so they normally would check back to a base type scheme of defense and put them in a different support pattern, and we had the advantage.
24-9 was the final score. Major Ogilvie had a whopping day, was named MVP, and had the time of his life, especially since Ohio State had lost in the Rose Bowl to Southern California. And so the 70s and the remarkable record of Alabama football teams during that decade ended on that New Year's Day at the Superdome. The next day, Alabama had the votes in the polls, finishing ahead of Southern California. National championship number 11. 3 coaches, 11 national champions. Wallace Wade 3, Frank Thomas 2. 4 of those teams played here in the Rose Bowl. Paul Bryant had 6 national champions. Coaches Mal Moore and Bill Oliver were in that group of building blocks back in 1961, part of an apparent legacy that still thrives at the capstone. Now, one of the young coaches on Paul Bryant's staff in 1961 was Gene Stallings, and he made it an even dozen national championships for Alabama in his 3rd season as head coach. But stay tuned. Gene Stallings has a lot of games left to coach.